This is Snake. I've reached the tank hangar. Wait, what?
Damn! Snake! It's a trap!
The name's Plissken. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the John Carpenter review series, and now we are at Escape from New York. This is a movie that, for whatever reason, I kind of missed in my childhood. I saw Escape from LA in the theaters with my father. I'll talk more about that when we get to that movie, but Escape from New York was one of those VHS tapes that we had that, for whatever reason, I never picked up as a kid. So this was a film I didn't see for the first time until maybe 6-7 years ago, and I've been a fan of it ever since, kicking myself in the ass why I didn't watch it as a kid. Now, John Carpenter is always somebody that achieves tension. He achieves this iconic sense of dread in a lot of his films. Most of his horror flicks are always known for having certain elements that he brings that is just makes him one of the horror masters out there. That's on that Mount Rushmore alongside people like Wes Craven. But once in a while, he kind of steps away from the horror and the thriller genre and provides more of an action experience. And that brings another signature element to Carpenter's movies that is always there, even in the horror films, and that's just being cool as fuck. There's a certain style, a certain don't give a fuck nature to a lot of what Carpenter brings to the film industry, and I think that movies like Escape from New York is where he gets a lot of that out, in just embodying the character of Snake Plissken and the story itself, and having a lot of themes about kind of fuck the government and fuck the man and everything. There's this rebellious nature to it that some of his action flicks just seem to bring out that side of his personality and that side of his storytelling. And in my opinion, Escape from New York is where that is all the most in the forefront.
About an hour ago, a small jet went down inside New York City. The president was on board.
President of what?
That's not funny, Plissken.
Starting off with the positives for Escape from New York, I really love the setup and the story of this film, to where you have, of course, New York, Manhattan Island has been walled off and become this super prison for the entire country, and anybody that goes in never comes out. And unfortunately, the President of the United States ends up crash landing inside of this prison, and they have to get somebody that can be badder, can be tougher and meaner than most of the prisoners inside of New York to go in and try to get the president and what he is concealing out. And I just think that's a badass setup for an action film. Even before you have a character like Snake Plissken that just is become an icon of the 80s action genre, that setup in and of itself just creates so many cool possibilities for a story that John Carpenter is going to fill with so much style. And I think that it works, and it remains very relevant, maybe even more relevant today than it was back in the 80s when it came out, because Carpenter was pulling from a lot of current events whenever he was coming up with this story. He actually wrote this before he hit the superstardom of Halloween and did films like The Fog and Assault on Precinct 13 and all that. He had this story ready to go, but no studio really wanted to back it. No studio wanted a story that was that violent, that bleak, that cynical, and treated the president as more so of a joke than this icon that we should be bowing down to. And it took until after the Watergate scandal for Carpenter to be able to retool the story just enough, and movies like Death Wish had came out with Charlie Bronson, and a lot more violent and bleak and cynical in the action thriller genre, for there to be this climate where Escape from New York actually had a place. I think you could make a very healthy argument that this is Carpenter's coolest score. Maybe not his best score, maybe not his most celebrated, certainly not his most celebrated, but the coolest score. There's something about this score and the score that's a little bit updated for Escape from LA that just has this badass cool edge to it. It still has some of those signature Carpenter kind of electronic sounds from the 80s, and you can definitely tell as soon as it plays that this is John Carpenter, but there's something different about it. He's not trying to elicit dread. He's not trying to elicit any kind of tension with it. He's just getting you pumped and geared up for the action thriller extravaganza he's going to send you on for the next 2 hours. And one of the things that impressed me so much when I watched it this most recent time was the production design and the set design, and how they really made this movie look like a post-apocalyptic version of New York. And they didn't even film in New York. It was way too expensive, way too chaotic, way too much of a liability to try to do what they needed to do in here in one of the busiest, if not the busiest city in the US. And so they actually went out and found a town in St. Louis, Missouri that was completely empty and abandoned. There was some kind of a fire that left nothing but the bones of this town. Everybody moved out and all of the decrepit buildings and areas were just left there. And they just had this golden egg just laid in front of them to hatch for this film, to where they filled it out with all these different New York visuals. They had certain things brought in, like the different pieces of a crashed plane to put the set design together for where the president's plane actually landed. And all throughout this film, you would swear you are in New York, even to the point where they find a bridge that looks just like the bridge in New York that they're going for. And so all throughout this, they keep that theme of post-apocalyptic, decrepit prison with signature New York flavor. Of course, when you're talking about these films, you have to bring up the main character of Snake Plissken. I would argue that aside from Michael Myers, Snake Plissken is the most iconic character that John Carpenter ever created, and he is so different from the action heroes and the action characters of the 80s. John McClane gets a lot of credit for being kind of the more everyday man, and I'm somebody that also gives him a lot of that credit, but that was like 7 years after this film came out, to where you have Kurt Russell, who at the time was only known for doing Disney shit and his previous work, which was playing Elvis with John Carpenter in the TV film. Smaller frame, good shape, but smaller frame. And this was still during that time where all the action heroes had to be Schwarzenegger or Stallone or somebody that's this huge hulking human being. And he was actually one of the first action heroes, action anti-heroes that looks like an everyday guy. He's not like glistening muscles going in there like a fucking walking tank ready to take on New York. He's just an everyday guy that has to survive because of his training, because of his cunning sense of being able to maneuver situations, because of his really don't give a fuck attitude. And so I think that a lot of the credit that John McClane gets, there's a piece of that that should be attributed to Kurt Russell and Snake Plissken.
You gonna kill me now, Snake?
I'm too tired. Maybe later.
And this movie is 100% the reason why Kurt Russell became one of the more action-centric heroes of the 80s. And you get films like Tango and Cash and, of course, Escape from LA. And he was able to break out of that Disney stigma. And this is the film that let him do it. John Carpenter did for him essentially what Quentin Tarantino did for people like John Travolta, to where they just knew this actor could play this role. They kind of made the role for that actor in mind, fought the studio to death about their vision for that character when the studio wanted somebody more seasoned like Clint Eastwood. And when the director got their way, you got somebody like Kurt Russell, who has become one of the more celebrated and iconic actors, especially in the 80s and 90s. And so just on a history level, I love learning about things like that and watching movies like this and just gaining even more of an appreciation that the reason we got some of my favorite movies with Kurt Russell is because he played Snake Plissken and because John Carpenter believed in him so much that he refused to let anybody else play that role. And what's so cool and different about Snake is that he doesn't have a whole lot of heroic qualities about him. Now, there's something I'm going to get into a little bit later that I think I need or I want in the character that's a little bit missing, but he really is not a hero. He is a villain that's brought into this situation to just take out the other villains. He's somebody that does not care about the government, does not care about the rules, doesn't even really care about the preservation of human life. I mean, everybody that he kind of teams up with throughout this mission dies at some point, and it doesn't really seem like it phases him all that much. And so he's somebody that is laser focused on the mission, laser focused on his own self-preservation, and his attitude, his kind of gravelly voice that he brings to it, the eye patch, all the different pieces that just makes even the visual of that character just stand out amongst all the other action heroes, anti-heroes of the 80s. He's one of the reasons why this film has stood the test of time. And moving more into the technical aspects, I think that this movie is extremely well lit. For a film that takes place entirely at night, they were able to utilize some new technology and cameras that required a lot less lighting, where every single scene in this movie, despite being dark and despite being kind of in shadows, even when he's actually in a decrepit building with no lighting whatsoever aside from like ambient fires, you can make out every single detail. This has never been a movie to where you have to adjust your TV set or adjust the brightness and contrast to be able to tell what's going on screen. And there's movies that were made 30, 40 years later that have that problem. So the way that they were able to keep the atmosphere of this dark, decrepit, prisonous New York and keep that tone of this dark action thriller that's very bleak and cynical with very low lighting and not sacrifice the clarity of the picture was a serious achievement for whoever was working the cameras. And of course, being that it's a John Carpenter film, you know that Dean Cundey is the most likely person that was behind those cameras, and suddenly it all makes sense. One of the greatest and most celebrated cinematographers of all time. And finally, something that I cannot say for very many movies out there, I actually think that the early primitive CGI and computer-generated images that they have in this age very well, because they were very subdued and they were very restricted, and they had things that looked like an advanced enough computer-generated graphic of the city and these maps and everything for something that came out in the early 80s, but even watching it 40-something odd years later, it still looks really good and it ages well. There's so many movies, and again, we'll talk about Escape from LA when we get to that used CGI that wasn't quite up to par, and it just ages the movie and makes it look worse every single year that it goes on. And this is one of those films where I feel like they knew exactly what their limits were, they knew exactly where the technology was at the time, and they didn't overreach past that. Moving on to the mixed aspects, the only one that I really have here is the Duke. I think that Isaac Hayes brings something cool to the role. At the time, he was mostly known for his music. You know, he wasn't attached to an iconic role that I think he's more well known for nowadays.
Hello there, children!
Hey, Chef!
But he brings an interesting, cool flavor to him. Again, cool is the word that I would use to describe Escape from New York. If I had to do a one-word review, it would be cool, and Isaac Hayes as the Duke is certainly a piece of that recipe. But I also feel like maybe it's the amount of screen time that he's given, maybe it's just the threatening nature that Isaac Hayes doesn't completely have in this movie because he's more cool than threatening. I don't feel like he's a villain that matches up to how larger than life the character of Snake Plissken is. And I think, again, we have the same problem in Escape from LA, to where you have a character like Snake Plissken, you have somebody that is an action hero, that's this iconic person that has all these cool attributes to his personality and his style and the look, that you need a villain to kind of match that on the opposite side of the spectrum. And I just don't feel like the Duke is that. You don't really understand why this guy is the leader of all the prisons. You don't really understand how he came to be. There's nothing about him that just makes you look at him and go, okay, I understand why everybody would cower to that guy. And so all the way through to the end of the film, where he is that one force chasing down Snake Plissken, trying to prevent him from completing his mission, he's a cool villain. He's just not the most effective villain in my mind. And as far as negatives, I really only have one thing that this movie does not give me. And as much as I like the fact that Snake Plissken is different in being pretty much as much of a villain that an anti-hero can be, I do feel like I'm missing a little bit of him having a humanity or a moral code to him. Now, obviously, he's not as evil or as inherently fucked up as a lot of the people that he goes against in this movie, but I feel like there's just something there to where they should have had a scene or a sequence to show that he does have some kind of a code, some kind of a line that he won't cross. And there was a deleted opening sequence that kind of achieved that, showing how he actually got caught and a partner of his that was killed in the process. But all throughout the film, everybody that he partners up with, everybody that he comes across that gets killed and that dies in the wake of his mission, you never really see him stop to like process that or to think about it or to feel any sort of way about it. Even when you get to the near end and you got Adrienne Barbeau, who dies in a really fucked up violent way to give him enough chance to move and to kind of distract the Duke to give him enough chance to complete his mission, you don't really get to see his reaction to that. And so for somebody that is such an iconic action character, somebody that you want us to follow and like and really be behind, which they still achieve, I just wish there was that little nugget of humanity that we could have gotten. It feels like a missing piece to his character. But overall, guys, I really love this film. This is one of those movies that I really wish that I had more nostalgia for, that I would have watched as a kid, because I know it would have been one of my favorites, would have been even higher on my list of favorites as an adult. But even though I'm late to the party, I'm still enjoying the fuck out of the punch. This is a great action thriller, some serious style and coolness from John Carpenter, and gave us one of the more iconic action characters of the 80s. Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you enjoyed this, please click over here for the rest of my John Carpenter reviews so far, and I'm also going to put my top 50 action films up here for you to check out. Please like and share this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything in the future of this review series. And as always, remember, opinions are like assholes, but that doesn't mean that you have to be.